Hello all, my name is Damren. I'll be presenting an overview of my upcoming capstone research project for Data 670. Working title of my project is Identifying the Political Influence on the Federal Emergency Management Agency's Fund Distribution. Let's begin. The purpose of this project is to answer the underlying question. When it comes to recovering from a disaster, how much does politics matter? And the issue of politics in this case is represented by whether a region that was impacted has recently voted for representatives along the same party lines as the sitting president. So why is this topic, and why now? Recently, NBC News published a report that revealed that in 2019, the Trump administration had withheld congressionally approved funding intended for Puerto Rico following Hurricane Maria in 2017. The report suggested the justification was inconsistent compared to other parts of the country and was likely politically motivated. This type of partisan activity is unsettling to emergency management community, especially given their belief that emergency response transcends politics. Therefore, the overarching question, in addition to the purpose, which, as a reminder, was when it comes to recovering from a disaster, how much does politics matter? The other question is, does a government support all people equally? And that's what we're looking to get into. But before diving into the details with regards to how the analysis will be done, I want to take a moment to explain how disasters get funded. Or rather, the recovery from disasters get funded. The first thing that needs to occur is a disaster needs to occur, actually. Or in some very rare cases, one needs to be imminent, such as a major hurricane that's about to make landfall. Now, FEMA has 20 different categories for disaster types, but on screen you can see just a few. So following the disaster, the next thing is that the governor will need to submit a request to the president asking him to declare a disaster. Now, this process is outlined within the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act. Officials from FEMA will also perform some preliminary damage assessments to accompany this request. Third step in this process is that the president is then responsible for determining whether to declare the event a disaster, which then, if it is, opens up a door for federal funding. Federal funding is approved by Congress, and it was known as the Disaster Relief Fund. This is a set amount requested by FEMA and approved by Congress well in advance of any actual disasters that occur. This is known as the annual appropriations. Now, if a disaster is so damaging additional funding is necessary, this gets approved through another process known as the supplemental appropriations. When the funds are ultimately distributed, keep in mind that it is aligned with the congressional budgetary rules, subcommittee oversights, as well as FEMA's discretion. So there are a number of layers, and it's relatively bureaucratic. The funding isn't just simply a check, like a blank check or a check to a certain amount of money. When it comes to public assistance, it's earmarked for certain projects. And some of these categories can be seen above. So debris, mitigation, roads, bridges, public buildings, public utilities, or how the state will manage the overall response and recovery to the effort. Disaster types, so the hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, and these recovery projects that you see here on the screen, these are two of the fields that'll be used as part of this analysis. Now, given that background, let's have a look at the data sets that will be used for this project. The big three are the Federal Emergency Management Agency's Public Assistance Funded Project Details dataset, election results, which will be used to provide political representation for the impacted area, and Census Bureau data, which will be used to determine the population of the impacted areas. So first, we'll take a look at the FEMA disaster data set. This is the central data set to the entire project. Now, there are over 730,000 entries and 22 variables. However, we're only going to be using 11 attributes, which will be used as part of this analysis. I introduced a few of them earlier, the incident type and damage category. In addition, we're also going to have some other identifying information, such as the declaration date, the disaster number, the location, the county code, the state. But more importantly, the key number is going to be this project amount, which is going to inform us with regards to how much money was allocated following the disaster for the recovery. Next is the political data. So there are 4 different data sets that are being used, and they represent the 4 different positions. So you have the president, senators, governors, and the House of Representatives. Now, the key detail of information that we're going to be using for all of these data sets is the political party of the winning candidate. Lastly, the analysis incorporates census data, which provides the population for the region, and it will also be leveraged to provide some historical context as well, to provide a view of the population's growth over time. Now, pulling it all together, you can see this diagram here represents each of those data sets and how they're linked and connected. So there are a couple other data tables that are leveraged to pull this whole thing together. And that's the Consumer Price Index, which accounts for inflation, and the Congressional District to County Relationship Table, which relates the House of Representatives to the counties which were impacted. Now, looking closely at this diagram, you can see that the linkages are often the year and the location. So for the governor, president, and senator, the location is going to be the state. And for the House of Representatives and the population, the location is represented by a FIPS code, which is really just a numerical ID for counties. Here you can also see the variables highlighted in yellow, which will be incorporated into the final data set, and green, which represent a calculated field. But in this diagram, that's really just the FIPS codes. So that brings us to our final project data set. Here you can see all the fields from across all of those data sets, which we've now combined, as well as the numerous calculated fields, which include population growth across different time periods, comparing the population growths, and the election results to determine whether or not an election was competitive. For the purpose of this analysis, competitive will be if the winner receives less than 52% of the vote. So once the final data set has been created, the next step is to analyze the data. To do this, data points will be, for a visual purpose, plotted on a Cartesian plane of funding versus population. Now, a regression line will be used to help determine a sort of midline for what should be expected regarding funding. This approach will serve as kind of the fundamental baseline and will be viewed from many different perspectives, but specifically for each president, for each disaster type, and for each project category. Now, what we'd expect is that as we observe the data and the trends, there doesn't appear to be any particular preference when you look at it as a whole, that one party versus another. The data set might look something like this. It's going to be evenly distributed on both sides, above and below the line. However, when we start filtering it down to a particular president or a particular data type, or disaster type rather, we might reveal some sort of impacted regions aligned to a particular political party for a particular president. So in this description, or in this particular visual, you see that now there are more red dots above the line than there are blue dots, which are now below the line. And from a mathematical kind of standpoint, what we're going to be looking at is 2 different types of regression. So One is going to be a multivariable linear regression line. This will be done to predict funding following a disaster and see if political alignment has statistical significance. There will be an initial analysis, which will include a multivariable logistic regression, so more binary, to predict if the funding will be above or below that population funding regression line. Now, one important aspect to consider before embarking on this research was, had this analysis been done before? And there actually had been some similar analysis. Economists Russell Sobel, Christopher Coyne, and Peter Leeson analyzed FEMA data following it being moved into the Department of Homeland Security right at the creation of DHS. Now, their analysis was focused on a number of events declared as disasters, and they had two interesting findings. First, they observed that following the creation of DHS, those on the subcommittee overseeing FEMA had less influence than they did before. What they had observed is that prior to DHS, those states which with members on the subcommittee were more likely to receive funding following a disaster. But this ended following the bureaucratic restructuring of DHS and the limiting power of some of these subcommittees. The second finding, that was both before and after the creation of DHS, was that presidents appeared to exert some political preferences. The states that were politically important to the president were more likely to receive disaster funding, and overall, more events were declared disasters by presidents during an election year compared with the other years. You can see that depicted by the graphs above, where the black columns are election years, specifically re-election years. The last year of their analysis ended in 2007. So this will be a continuation of their analysis, as well as considering additional factors like some of the other representatives, the competitiveness of a particular region or area, and a breakdown of disaster types and projects. So given all that, I'm predicting that the results will be similar to the findings by Sobel and company, that congressional influence is likely to be minimal, and there will be some presidential influence. Additionally, when it comes to predicting the funding amount, I anticipate population change, and disaster type to be stronger indicators than any political alignment. To determine the success of this analysis, the following key performance indicators will be used. Statistical significance of 0.90 regarding the influence of political alignment. Chi-squared value, which will be comparing the political alignment of the counties with declared disasters and the political alignment of counties across the country. And lastly, the S-score, which uses components from a confusion matrix, so things like true positive, true negative values. This helps provide insight into the strength of the model. This will be used on the logistic model for the above and below the regression line concepts. So that summarizes where the project is at this point. And next, I will begin the process of cleaning, transforming, and loading the data in order to begin analyzing it. So thank you for taking time to listen to my project and its overview.